The first foundation is visible, capital infrastructure, people, systems, the tangible, physical components of an enterprise that can be observed, measured, and pointed to as evidence of what has been built. The second foundation is invisible, and it is the one that almost nobody talks about when discussing how the greatest business empires on this continent and beyond were actually constructed. It is knowledge, specifically the continuous, deliberate, disciplined acquisition of knowledge, not the knowledge acquired through formal education and then left to stagnate, but the ongoing, daily habit of learning that continues long after school has ended, long after early career struggles have been navigated, long after any reasonable person might conclude that sufficient knowledge has already been accumulated to justify resting on what has already been learned. Dangote reads for a minimum of 2 hours every single day, not occasionally, not when he has time, not when a particularly interesting book happens to cross his desk. Every day, as a non-negotiable component of his daily schedule, maintained across decades of building an enterprise that now spans multiple countries, multiple sectors, and employs tens of thousands of people. This single habit, more than any specific business decision, more than any particular investment, more than any specific strategic move, may be the most replicable and most undervalued component of how he built what he built. Today I am going to show you exactly why this habit matters so much more than it initially appears, what specifically it produces that cannot be acquired through any other means, and the exact framework for building this habit into your own daily schedule regardless of how constrained your available time currently feels. Why most people stop learning after school. Before the framework itself, I want to address something directly. Most people, when they hear that successful people read 2 hours every day, nod in acknowledgement and then do nothing different. The advice seems obvious. The execution never happens. Understanding precisely why this gap between acknowledgement and execution exists is the first step toward actually closing it. The primary reason most people stop deliberate, disciplined learning after formal education ends is that school, whatever its limitations, provides external structure for learning. There is a curriculum, there are assignments, there are deadlines and examinations and consequences for not engaging with the material. Learning happens not primarily because of internal motivation, but because of external pressure. When that external structure disappears, as it does the moment formal education concludes, as the internal motivation required to sustain deliberate learning in the absence of external pressure turns out to be far less robust than most people assumed it would be. The intention to keep learning remains. The actual habit of doing it consistently, without external accountability, typically does not survive contact with the competing demands of adult life for very long. The second reason is a specific cognitive bias that researchers have documented extensively, the illusion of knowing enough. Once a person reaches a certain level of competence in their field, their awareness of what they do not know paradoxically decreases rather than increases, creating a subjective sense of having accumulated sufficient knowledge even as the actual landscape of what remains to be learned continues expanding. The more competent a person becomes, the more confidently they may feel that their current level of knowledge is adequate for their current needs. Exactly when the knowledge gap between their current level and the level required for the next stage of their development is actually growing larger, not smaller. Dangote has never succumbed to this illusion. 4 decades into building an industrial empire that makes him one of the most experienced business operators on this continent, he continues reading 2 hours every day as if the knowledge accumulated across those 4 decades were insufficient for the challenges the next decade will bring, because he understands something about the nature of knowledge in a rapidly changing world that the illusion of knowing enough specifically prevents most people from seeing clearly. Knowledge has a half-life. What was sufficient knowledge for navigating the business environment of a decade ago is demonstrably insufficient for navigating the business environment of today, because the environment itself has changed substantially. This means that even knowledge genuinely adequate for the challenges of a specific moment begins depreciating immediately upon acquisition, requiring continuous replacement and expansion simply to maintain an equivalent level of real competence, quite aside from the additional knowledge required to genuinely advance. What 2 hours of daily reading actually produces? Let me be specific about what this habit produces, because understanding the specific outputs of disciplined daily reading makes the investment of time it requires feel proportionate to what it returns. The first output is what I would call expanded pattern recognition. Every book, every article, every well-constructed piece of analytical writing that a person engages with deeply adds to a mental library of patterns and frameworks for understanding how specific types of situations tend to unfold, what factors tend to determine outcomes in specific types of decisions, what warning signs tend to precede specific types of failures. This pattern library, accumulated across years of disciplined reading, produces something that functions almost like intuition in experienced decision makers, but is actually something far more reliable than intuition in the conventional sense. When Dangote encounters a new business situation, a new market challenge, or a new strategic decision, he is drawing on a pattern library, accumulated across decades of both direct experience and deliberate reading, a library so extensive that recognizing relevant patterns in new situations becomes genuinely faster and more reliable than for someone without that accumulated library, regardless of raw intelligence or formal educational credentials. The second output is access to compressed experience. A book representing the life's work of an expert in a specific field, whether that field is financial management, organizational behavior, negotiating strategy, or any other domain relevant to building and running enterprises, delivers decades of accumulated learning and insight in a form that can be absorbed in hours or days, rather than years. This represents an extraordinary asymmetry between the time invested and the experiential value received, one that Dangote has explicitly described as central to his understanding of why reading consistently produces such disproportionate returns relative to the time invested. The third output is the continuous expansion of the range of options visible when facing any specific decision. Every additional domain of knowledge a person possesses increases the number of potential approaches visible to them when confronting a challenge in any area, because knowledge from one domain frequently suggests solutions applicable to challenges in apparently unrelated domains. The engineering principle of redundant systems, understood through reading about infrastructure design, suggests organizational design principles for building resilient business structures. The ecological concept of competitive advantage through specialization, understood through reading about biology, suggests competitive strategy principles for positioning a business in a crowded market. This cross-domain transfer of insight, available only to people who read broadly, rather than exclusively, within their specific professional domain, is precisely what produces the kind of creative problem-solving that distinguishes genuinely exceptional decision-makers from merely competent ones. If you are still watching, subscribe right now, because what comes next is the exact framework for building this 2-hour daily reading habit into whatever schedule you currently have, including the specific solutions for the most common obstacles that prevent most people from sustaining this habit beyond the first few weeks of attempting it. The framework for building the habit. Let me give you the specific structure Dangote's reading habit suggests, adapted for the practical constraints most people reading this actually face. The first component is time blocking, not time finding. The single most common reason ambitious reading intentions fail in practice is treating reading time as something to be found in whatever gaps happen to exist in a given day, rather than something to be deliberately protected as a non-negotiable commitment. Time found in daily gaps is the first casualty of any unexpected demand on that day. A meeting that runs long, a family obligation that emerges, an unexpected problem requiring attention. Any of these eliminates the available gap, and the reading simply does not happen on that day. Once this pattern repeats enough times, the habit never consolidates, because habits require consistency rather than occasional occurrence to become genuinely automatic. Time blocked is different in a specific and important way. It exists on the schedule as a fixed commitment before any specific day's demands become known, exactly like any other non-negotiable appointment. Missing it requires actively deciding to cancel a specific, scheduled commitment rather than simply failing to find an available gap. The specific time of day matters less than the consistency of the block. Some people find early morning, before the day's demands begin competing for attention, most reliable for protecting reading time. Others find late evening, after primary obligations have been addressed, more sustainable. What matters is that the block is fixed, consistent, and treated with the same non-negotiable status as any other critical daily commitment. The second component is deliberate selection, not random consumption. 2 hours of daily reading produces dramatically different outputs, depending on what is being read, in what proportion, and with what intention. Dangote's reading is not primarily recreational, though there is genuine value in some proportion of less structured reading as well. The core of his daily reading is deliberately selected to expand knowledge in domains directly relevant to the challenges and opportunities he currently faces or anticipates facing, supplemented by reading in adjacent domains where pattern transfer is most likely to produce useful insight. For someone at an earlier stage of building financial foundations than Dangote's current position, this means being deliberate about which domains of knowledge most directly address the specific challenges of your current stage, whether that is financial management, business operations, negotiating, understanding specific investment categories, or building and managing teams, while also deliberately including some proportion of reading in broader domains where unexpected insights frequently emerge. The third component is active engagement, not passive consumption. Reading in the way that produces the pattern library and expanded option range described earlier requires a specific type of engagement that is more demanding than simply moving through pages and retaining general impressions. This means pausing at specific points to ask explicitly what this specific insight means for your specific situation, rather than simply absorbing it as an interesting observation about someone else's context. It means connecting specific ideas encountered in one book to specific ideas encountered previously in other books, building the cross-domain library that produces genuine insight transfer. And it means noting, in a specific and retrievable form, the insights that seem most directly applicable to your current challenges, rather than trusting that the memory of a general impression will be available when actually needed. The specific method for capturing and organizing these insights matters less than establishing some consistent practice of doing so, since the value of accumulated reading compounds most effectively when previously encountered insights remain accessible and connectable to new material, rather than simply fading as undifferentiated general impressions once the specific book is finished. The fourth component is beginning immediately, rather than optimally. This is the component most people overlook, and it is frequently the one that actually determines whether this habit gets built at all. The temptation when confronting a 2-hour daily reading commitment is to wait until the circumstances for beginning feel optimal. When the right book has been identified, when the right time slot has been found, when the current period of unusual busyness has passed, when some specific precondition for beginning has been satisfied. This waiting for optimal conditions is precisely the pattern that keeps most people's reading intentions permanently in the future rather than actually executing in the present. Dangote did not begin his reading habit when optimal conditions arrived. He began it when the value of continuous learning became clear to him, regardless of how imperfect the initial conditions were for sustaining it, Begin today with whatever book is most immediately accessible and most directly relevant to your current situation. For whatever amount of time is genuinely available today, even if that amount falls short of the 2-hour target that represents the sustained, fully developed version of this habit. The gap between 15 minutes of daily reading today and 2 hours of daily reading eventually is closed through gradual expansion of a habit that has been started, not through waiting until 2 hours feels immediately available and sustainable. What this habit produces over a decade. I want to close by being specific about what 10 years of sustained daily reading actually accumulates in concrete terms, because the abstract value of knowledge can feel insufficient motivation relative to the immediate time investment required. Someone reading for 2 hours every day across 10 years will have invested approximately 7,300 hours in deliberate knowledge acquisition. At a pace of roughly 1 substantial book per week, this represents exposure to approximately 500 books across a decade or more, depending on the specific reading pace and the proportion of longer versus shorter works involved. This is not an abstract accumulation. It is a specific, retrievable library of frameworks, patterns, and insights across whatever domains those 500 books covered. It is decades of compressed experience from hundreds of practitioners, researchers, and thinkers across every field relevant to the challenges of building genuine financial security and business success. Dangote's pattern library, accumulated across more than 4 decades of this daily habit, is one of the most significant competitive advantages he possesses, more significant, arguably, than any specific capital asset or market position, because it is the resource that has informed every other resource allocation decision across his entire career. The same library, built beginning today at whatever modest scale is immediately sustainable, becomes one of your most significant competitive advantages over the years and decades ahead. Not because reading makes you smarter in any general sense, but because the specific patterns, frameworks, and insights accumulated through disciplined daily reading make the problems you encounter look more familiar than they otherwise would, make the options available for addressing them more numerous than they otherwise appear, and make the decisions required to navigate them more informed than they otherwise could be. That is what 2 hours of daily reading actually produces. Begin today. If this video gave you something concrete to start this week, subscribe. New videos every 2 days on the mindset and systems behind Africa's greatest business empire. See you in the next one.